They told Cal Becker the canyon swallowed secrets. They never mentioned how loudly one would scream to be found. The night the truth finally broke open, it wasn't a gunshot or a confession that saved him. It was the sound of his dog growling at a wall no man had ever questioned, a low warning that cut through years of silence. People say dogs sense danger. Shadow sensed something far worse, a truth that had been buried alive. And when it rose, nothing in Red Canyon stayed quiet again. What would your dog do if the world tried to hide something from him? The snow came in sideways as Cal Becker eased his aging pickup down the last bend toward Red Canyon. The wind clawed at the windshield hard enough to rattle the frame, and the world outside blurred into shifting white currents. His knuckles tightened around the steering wheel. Storms never bothered him. What bothered him was the quiet that followed them, the kind of quiet where memory came back sharper than it should. Shadow sat upright in the passenger seat, balanced like a creature born for instability. The shepherd's grey-black coat bristled every time the wind slammed into the truck. His ears flicked once, twice, then focused forward as if he sensed something deeper than weather waiting for them down in the canyon. Red Canyon appeared just beyond a sweep of red cliffs, the storm pounding their ridgelines until the rock looked as if it bled beneath the snow. The courthouse annex sat alone at the end of an icy street. A handful of trucks were parked out front, engines steaming in the cold. No movement, no voices. The whole place looked like it had been abandoned mid-thought. Inside, the air smelled of coat wool, burnt coffee, and old paper. People had gathered in stiff silence. Ranchers, mechanics, 2 women in quilted jackets. None of them talked. They simply turned toward Cal as he entered, their eyes flicking briefly to Shadow before snapping away again. Shadow didn't break stride. He walked at Cal's leg with that same steady military gait he'd kept through 2 deployments. When Cal found a seat against the back wall, the shepherd lay beside him without a sound. Only his eyes moved, tracking every person in the room. The auctioneer read off items like a man trying to outrun the storm. A skid loader, a pair of rusted generators, a trailer. No one seemed interested until the last listing. Parcel 41A, known locally as the Ridge Cabin. Condition poor. 1 well, no power, 15 years of unpaid taxes, starting at $500. The air changed. Not a gust, not a shift of weight. Something deeper. Several people looked down at their boots. One man cleared his throat but said nothing. The sheriff, a broad figure slouched near the door, lifted his gaze to Cal and didn't blink. Cal raised his hand. 500. Any advance? Silence. But it wasn't apathy. It was hesitation sharpened into fear. Cal felt it settle across the room like a slow freeze. Something in him stirred. Shadow lifted his head, ears angling towards the front as if hearing more than human voices. Sold. Gentleman in the back. The gavel cracked through the room. A woman near the heater flinched. Another man muttered something under his breath, quick, like a warning meant for no one and everyone. When Cal approached the table to sign the deed, the clerk pushed the papers toward him fast, as if eager to have the transaction exist as briefly as possible. He signed anyway. Shadow leaned into his leg, steady as an anchor. Outside, the snow had calmed into soft flakes drifting in the dark. Cal loaded a few supplies from the hardware store. The old man behind the counter slipped one comment between scanned items. You bought the Ridge Cabin. Cal nodded once. Should have asked the sheriff what happened there before you raised your hand. Cal kept his voice level. I'm just looking for quiet. The man didn't smile. Quiet's the one thing that place won't give you. Cal drove toward Stone Ridge as the storm finally loosened its grip. The road narrowed until it was nothing but tire ruts carved through a corridor of juniper and red stone. The cabin emerged like an unfinished memory, half buried under snow, its roof bowed but still standing. The stone ridge towered behind it, jagged and dark, as if watching. Cal stepped out first. Shadow stayed in the truck an extra second, nose lifted, body tense. When he jumped down, he landed light as a whisper, but the soft fur along his spine was raised. Inside, the cabin air was colder than the storm. A wool coat still hung by the door. A book lay face down on a table, pages fused by time. Dust swallowed sound, and the fireplace, built entirely from Stone Ridge rock, dominated the room. Perfectly fitted stones, rough and silent. Shadow moved before Cal did. He padded straight to the hearth, head low, tail stiff. He didn't bark, didn't whine. But his breath changed, shorter, harder, the way it used to when he scented explosives buried under floorboards. Cal crouched beside him. "You smell something?" Shadow didn't look away. He placed a paw against one of the stones, scraping once, deliberate. Cal froze. In the quiet, those few grains of mortar falling felt like the loudest thing in the world. This isn't just a fireplace. A low rumble drifted out from deep inside Shadow's chest. Not warning, recognition. Cal stood slowly, scanning the cabin. Shadow's stare didn't break. That kind of instinct wasn't random. It was earned in fire and dust and places where hesitation killed. Behind them, wind slipped through a gap in the window frame, carrying the faintest draft across the room. It touched the back of Cal's neck colder than any winter breeze should. Like the cabin exhaled. He turned back to the hearth. For the first time, he noticed it. One stone near the bottom that didn't match the flow of the others. Edges too precise. Surface too smooth. The first plot twist arrived quietly. Without drama. Without sound. Shadow stepped back and sat, rigid, watching the stone as if it might move. Cal whispered into the empty room. "What the hell were you guarding for 15 years? No answer came. Only the growing certainty that Red Canyon hadn't been abandoned by chance, and that whatever waited behind that stone hadn't been meant to survive the man who hid it. Shadow finally looked up at him. Eyes bright, steady, urgent. And in that moment Cal understood. He hadn't bought a forgotten cabin. He had stepped into someone else's unfinished war. Cal spent the next morning forcing order onto the small cabin, trying to make sense of a place that felt older than its walls. He swept dust from corners, cleared cobwebs from beams, and patched gaps in the windows where winter had carved tiny wounds into the wood. The work steadied his hands. It always had. Fixing things was simple, predictable, unlike the nights he wished he could forget. Shadow stayed close but restless, pacing the perimeter of the room like he was running a perimeter check in a combat zone. Every few minutes he circled back to the stone wall behind the fireplace. He would sniff once, then again, then lower his head slightly. Not fear, not curiosity. Focus. Cal watched him from the kitchen counter where he was hammering a loose board back into place. He paused mid-swing. Shadow's tail had gone still. Completely still. For a German shepherd, stillness like that meant something was wrong. "What do you hear?" Shadow didn't look away from the wall. His ears twitched once, then flattened in a slow, deliberate posture Cal had seen before. Afghanistan. A schoolhouse with a false floor. Explosives hidden under concrete. Shadow had taken the same stance then. A freeze so intense it felt like time had narrowed around them. Cal set the hammer down. He walked toward the dog and knelt beside him, placing a hand gently along Shadow's back. The muscles there were tight, coiled, vibrating with an instinct sharpened by training and survival, not fear. "Nothing's moving," Cal murmured. But Shadow disagreed. The shepherd stepped closer to the stone ridge wall and pressed his nose to the seam between two larger slabs of red rock. his breath fogged against the cold stone. A low growl slipped out, almost reluctant, as if he was trying to warn without alarming. Cal leaned in, ear near the stone. Nothing. No draft, no echo of shifting rock, no sound at all. But Shadow's warning was persistent, a steady thrum in the room. "You're not guessing. You know." A faint chill crawled up the side of Cal's neck. Shadow had never been wrong. Not once. Not through gunfire, not through raids, not through nights when silence itself was a threat. Cal stepped back, trying to shake the feeling. He forced himself to return to his tasks, unpacking canned food, blankets, tools. Normal things. Solid things. But even in the middle of the cabin, his attention drifted back to Shadow. The dog hadn't moved more than a foot in 10 minutes. When dusk bled into the room, Cal lit the lanterns. The flame cracked against cold glass. The shadows along the wall deepened. And Shadow stiffened with them. That night, Cal stretched out on the cot by the far window. The cold had crept into the floorboards, enough to make his breath cloud. He tossed another piece of wood into the fireplace and watched the flames bend upward, slow and uneven. Shadow settled beside him at first. Warm, steady. But an hour later, Cal woke to a sound he recognized instantly. A growl, low enough to be felt more than heard. He sat up. Shadow was no longer by his cot. The shepherd stood at the foot of the fireplace, posture rigid, chest forward. His entire body pointed toward the stone ridge wall again. His breath was controlled, deliberate. Cal held his breath. Then he heard it. A faint shift. Not the house settling. Not the wind. Something like a click deep inside the stone. A sound so small he might have dismissed it if Shadow hadn't reacted. The shepherd stepped back and released another growl, deeper this time, gaining shape. His tail pointed straight out, his ears locked forward. He wasn't warning Cal, he was warning whatever was behind that wall. Cal reached for the rifle leaning against the crate near his bed. His fingers brushed the stock. He didn't lift it yet. Not yet. His training told him to trust all senses, not just fear. He listened again. Silence. But silence could lie. Cal whispered into the dark, "Shadow, come here." Shadow didn't move. Instead, he took one deliberate step closer to the wall, planted his front paw on a particular slab, and pushed, not scratching this time, pushing, hard enough that the stone shifted a fraction of an inch. Cal's breath stalled. He walked toward the fireplace, the lantern flame trembling behind them. He reached out and placed his palm flat against the stone Shadow had touched. It was colder than the others. Much colder, as if air from somewhere deeper passed through it. And the twist came fast. A hollow sound echoed behind the slab. Not rock, not soil. Space. Someone had carved a cavity into the ridge itself. Cal stepped back, heart beating faster now. Shadow stood at his side, pressing his shoulder into Cal's leg, something he only did when danger was near, but not yet visible. Cal whispered, "That wall isn't solid." Shadow didn't break eye contact with the stone. His breathing grew sharper, measured to keep his senses open. Cal recognized the pattern. It was the same way Shadow had stood seconds before detecting tripwire in a collapsed stairwell years ago. A memory hit Cal hard, his lieutenant saying, "If he alerts, you follow him, or you die tired." Shadow growled again. Then came a second sound behind the stone, a shuffling scrape. Faint, too controlled to be the wind, too slow to be an animal. Someone had once opened that wall, and maybe someone meant for it to open again. Cal backed away slowly, hand steady on Shadow's collar. "Not tonight," he whispered. Shadow did not take his eyes off the stone until Cal drew him back toward the cot, easing them both into a defensive position as the lantern flickered. Outside, the storm weakened. But inside, the cabin felt like it was holding its breath, watching them, waiting. Cal rested a hand on Shadow's neck and whispered the truth he didn't want to admit. A dog never warns for nothing. And this warning had only just begun. The wind turned sharp after midnight, slicing across the canyon like it carried teeth. Cal woke to the sound of nails scraping stone. Not frantic, focused, purposeful. The kind of digging Shadow only did when instinct overruled obedience. Shadow was at the base of the stone ridge wall, paws braced, body angled low, claws biting into the mortar line between two lower slabs. Dust scattered in small bursts each time he struck, the quiet rhythmic scrape carving through the cabin's silence. Cal grabbed the lantern and crossed the room fast. Shadow didn't look at him. He didn't need to. His whole posture said the same thing he had said on battlefields, on night raids, in ruined cities where danger lived beneath the floor. Here. Right here. Cal lifted the lantern. The light shook in his hand. One stone near the floor stood out immediately. While the others were rough, irregular, sculpted by centuries of canyon wind, this one was rectangular. Perfect edges, too deliberate, too placed. He knelt, brushed away the dust Shadow had kicked loose, and ran his thumb along its seam. The mortar was darker than the rest, smoother, newer. Someone didn't build this wall, someone hid something inside it. Shadow let out a quick breath, half growl, half urging. Cal wedged his fingers against the stone's lower ridge. It didn't budge. Shadow nudged his arm, then pressed his own weight against the opposite edge, as if trying to show him the angle. All right. Together. Cal shifted his grip, braced a boot against the floor, and pulled. The stone moved. Not much. Half an inch. But that half inch revealed something impossible. Cold air seeped through the new gap, air that didn't smell of earth or damp or rot. It smelled dry, ancient, like air trapped away from the world for too long. Shadow stepped back, ears sharp, tail frozen straight. Cal set the lantern down and forced both hands under the stone's lower lip. It resisted at first, then gave suddenly, sliding free with a sound like bone dragged across slate. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. Behind it was a dark cavity carved into the ridge. Not natural. Someone had cut this chamber by hand, just big enough for a man to reach into but deep enough to swallow a secret hole. Cal lifted the lantern and held it close. Inside sat three things. A metal case, sealed tight with industrial latches. A notebook, its edges warped but intact. And a faint smell drifting out. Dry, dusty. A trace of something burned long ago. Shadow didn't enter the space. He sat beside it, rigid, watching the darkness like he expected something to claw its way out. Cal reached in carefully, fingers trembling despite himself, and pulled the notebook free. The cover cracked under his touch. It was leather once, now faded to a color between rust and ash. He flipped it open. The first page held a name written in blocky, determined handwriting. Jonah Reddick. Cal froze. He knew that name. Everyone who paid attention to the world beyond television knew it. Jonah Reddick had been an investigative reporter who vanished 12 years ago while pursuing a corruption story in Utah. His truck was found abandoned near Red Canyon. No body, no signs of struggle, just a case file that went cold before it ever warmed. Shadow whined, a low, uneasy sound. Cal turned the next page. Field notes, dates, coordinates, then lines filled with hurried strokes as if written in fear. If you find this, I didn't leave by choice. A chill crept down Cal's spine. He looked at the darkness inside the cavity again. The smell of char, the unnatural dryness, the fact that Jonah's notebook had been sealed away like evidence someone didn't want found. He reached for the metal case next. It was heavier than he expected. Thick, Military grade. He held it in both hands, feeling its cold weight settle into his palms. Shadow growled. Not at the darkness, not at the case, at the cabin door. Cal turned. The handle hadn't moved. The windows hadn't rattled. But Shadow was locked onto the entrance, muscles rising beneath his fur, a stance of absolute alert. Cal murmured, "What did you hear?" Shadow didn't blink. A gust hit the cabin hard enough to shake the walls. But it wasn't the wind that had Shadow on edge. Cal felt it now, too. That sense from old deployments, when the silence before a breach was louder than any explosion. He moved quietly to the window, lantern low. Outside, the snow was disturbed. Tracks, several, fresh, leading toward the cabin but stopping just out of lantern reach. Human. Heavy. Someone had stood there long enough to compress the snow, then walked back into the tree line. Cal felt his pulse tighten. Shadow remained between him and the door, a barrier of muscle and instinct, never once looking away from the outside world. Cal returned to the fireplace, chest tight. Whoever had been here tonight wasn't curious. They were checking, watching, making sure the cabin's secrets stayed buried. He looked at the notebook again. Jonah Reddick, missing 12 years, hidden in a wall like a message no one was supposed to hear. And then another twist slipped in quietly. At the very bottom of the cavity, half covered in dust, was something thin. A strip of paper. No, not paper. A photograph. Burnt along the edges. Cal reached for it and pulled it into the lantern light. A man stood beside the stone ridge, smiling awkwardly at the camera. Behind him was the same wall Cal had just opened. Same stones, same pattern, same shape of the false slab. The man was Jonah Reddick, and over his shoulder, blurred but unmistakable, was the face of someone Cal had seen only hours earlier in the courthouse annex. Sheriff Doyle. Shadow growled again. This time Cal understood exactly why. The storm eased by morning, but the cabin felt tighter than before, as if the discovery inside the stone ridge wall had narrowed the space around Cal. He sat at the small table with the lantern burning low, Jonah Reddick's notebook open in front of him. The pages were stiff with age, but the handwriting was steady, deliberate, written by a man who knew he didn't have time for flourishes. Red Canyon water corridors, unauthorized drilling reports, chemical spills hidden in quarterly summaries, private security units operating without county oversight. Cal exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Jonah hadn't been poking at a rumor. He had been digging into a corporation with enough power to bend permits, rewrite boundaries, and silence a man without leaving a trace. Page after page listed metals Cal recognized from briefing files overseas: arsenic, vanadium, mercury runoff. Levels Jonah had tested himself and documented with precision. Under Stone Ridge, Jonah wrote, "The ground isn't dead. It's poisoned." Shadow paced the length of the room again. Every time the wind shifted outside, the shepherd froze, ears up, listening with the kind of attention that once kept a platoon alive. Cal tried to ignore the way Shadow's steps mapped the same route over and over, from door to hearth to window, but each pass ratcheted his tension another degree. He turned another page. Jonah's notes changed tone. Less analytical, more frantic. Someone followed me from the ridge. Truck with no plates. A man at the county office asked why I was mapping water lines. My request for public records disappeared from the system. Cal felt the words land heavy. This wasn't investigative reporting anymore. This was survival. Jonah knew he'd pushed too far. Knew someone was watching. He flipped again. 2 nights ago, someone cut the wires to my generator. Found footprints in the snow near the north wall. They aren't trying to scare me. They're preparing the ground for something else. Cal looked up, pulse kicking harder. Shadow was standing perfectly still by the door, not growling, not whining. Listening. "What is it, partner?" Shadow didn't move. His ears twitched once toward the window. Cal set the notebook aside and crossed the room quietly. He pulled the curtain back a sliver. The tree line sat in its usual shadow, the canyon floor blanketed with snow reflecting faint morning light. But there, almost lost behind a stand of pines, was a dark shape that didn't belong. A vehicle, half hidden, parked 200 meters from the cabin. No one stepped out. No engine noise, no movement. Just the steady, unnatural stillness of a predator waiting. Cal let the curtain fall shut. Shadow stepped between him and the door, not in fear, but in readiness. His body angled, slightly, distributing weight, preparing for whatever came next. Cal's throat tightened. He returned to the table and picked up Jonah's notebook again, as if the next page might give him the answer for what waited outside. Jonah's handwriting shook on this one. "I am being watched all hours. Someone tampered with my samples. A sheriff's deputy asked too many questions about my location. If anything happens, the truth is inside the ridge. The truth is inside the ridge." Cal stared at the words until they blurred. Shadow growled then. Short, low, a single warning that echoed Jonah's fear across 12 years. Cal extinguished the lantern to keep the glare off the windows. Darkness swallowed the cabin, leaving only thin light from the snow outside. He sat beside Shadow, hand pressed gently behind the dog's shoulder blades, grounding himself in a steady heartbeat that had outlasted war. Another sound cut through the cold. Tires shifting on frozen ground. The truck outside repositioning. Closer this time. Cal felt his breath shorten, not from panic but from calculation. Someone had been here last night. Someone had stood at the edge of the woods watching. And now someone had returned, patient, unhurried, confident that no one would challenge them this deep into Red Canyon. He went back to Jonah's notebook and flipped to the final entries. He needed to know how far Jonah had gotten, how close he had come to unlocking the reason he died. A map was sketched across 2 pages, water lines, waste injection sites, a red circle around Stone Ridge. Then a sentence that made Cal's stomach twist. "I think Sheriff Doyle knows." Cal closed the notebook slowly. Shadow moved to the window again. His body stiffened, and for a moment he looked exactly the way he had on a night in Helmand Province, seconds before the first explosion tore through the valley. It wasn't the stance of a pet. It was the stance of a soldier recognizing an old threat. Cal whispered, "What do you see?" Shadow's tail didn't move. His breath tightened. And then his head turned toward the Stone Ridge wall as if something behind that ancient rock formation had shifted with the arrival of the truck outside. A sudden realization hit Cal, sharp enough to jolt him upright. Whoever parked out there wasn't just watching the cabin. They were checking the wall. Jonah hadn't been silenced because of what he found. He had been silenced because of where he hid it. The truth wasn't just in the ridge. The ridge itself was the vault. Shadow stepped closer to Cal and bumped his leg once, a gesture he hadn't used since they were under fire overseas. "Move, now!" Cal grabbed Jonah's notebook, the metal case, and slung his rifle over his shoulder. He crouched beside Shadow and whispered into the dark, steady and certain. "We're not alone out here." Shadow pressed against him, ready. Outside, the hidden truck's engine rumbled once like a throat clearing. And in that moment Cal understood, something Jonah Reddick had written but never had time to explain. When you get this close to the truth looks back. Sheriff Doyle Harper arrived just after noon, the hour when the canyon sun fell hard against the red rock and cast long, unforgiving shadows. Cal saw the dust first, drifting along the trail like smoke. Then the cruiser appeared, creeping slow, tires crunching through frozen gravel, engine too quiet for a man who wanted to be noticed. Doyle stepped out wearing a jacket so new it didn't match the dust on his boots, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Afternoon, Becca," Thought I'd check on the new landowner. Cal didn't answer right away. Shadow had already stepped forward, planting himself between them, body stiff, one paw forward, the stance of a dog drawing a line. Doyle's gaze dropped to the shepherd. "Good-looking animal you've got there," he said. Shadow didn't blink. Cal folded his arms. "Something I can help you with?" Doyle took a slow walk around the clearing, hands in his pockets, studying the cabin with an expression that made Cal's skin pull tight. Not curiosity. Assessment. Measuring the man, the dog, the space between them. "You came into quite a piece of property," Doyle said, pausing near the porch steps. "Folks say the ridge is temperamental. Best not to dig too deep around here." Shadow stepped closer, a silent warning. Cal placed a hand on the dog's back, but his eyes stayed locked on Doyle. "I'm not here to make trouble, Sheriff." Doyle's smile twitched. Trouble doesn't need an invitation. He walked toward the ridge wall, brushing his fingers almost casually along the red stone, but Cal caught the subtle pause when Doyle's thumb touched the exact slab Shadow had exposed the night before. The sheriff's jaw tightened by a fraction before he pulled his hand away. "Nice craftsmanship," he said softly. "Shame about the old owners. That reporter who vanished? Jonah Reddick? Heard you had an interest in local history." Cal's pulse climbed. He kept his face blank. "I've read a headline or two." Doyle stepped back toward the cruiser. "Just remember, Becca, Red Canyon is a place that takes care of its own. Outsiders don't always read the terrain right." Shadow growled, deep and unbroken. Doyle stopped in his tracks, met the dog's eyes, and for the first time his smile dropped. The mask slipped just enough to show something colder underneath. "Control your animal," he said sharply. Cal didn't move. He doesn't bite without reason. Doyle held Cal's stare for a long, heavy second. Then he gave a tight nod and climbed into the cruiser. As the vehicle reversed down the road, his window rolled down halfway. "Some stones aren't meant to be moved, Becca." The cruiser disappeared into the bend. Shadow stayed fixed on the road long after the sound of the engine faded. Cal knelt beside him, placing both hands on the dog's shoulders. Shadow's heartbeat was elevated, not from fear but from recognition. He sensed something predatory in Doyle, something practiced. Cal walked toward the truck to clear his head, but stopped short. His breath caught. The rear tire sagged, air hissing soft and steady through a thin surgical slice. Not a puncture. A cut made by someone who knew exactly how to render a man stranded without alerting him immediately. A professional's message. He crouched and examined the tread. The incision was deliberate, clean. Shadow sniffed the rubber, then turned abruptly and followed a trail Cal hadn't yet noticed. Boot prints circling the cabin. Wide steps, careful placement. Someone had moved around the building with intention, not curiosity. Shadow led him farther, nose low, tail straight, until they reached a thicket of juniper bushes near the ridge. The dog stopped, squared his stance, then angled his head toward the center of the brush. Cal parted the branches. A camera lens stared back at him. A small, motion-activated unit. Modern. Expensive. Its tiny green indicator light blinked once before fading, as if whoever was watching had just shut the feed. Cal's stomach tightened. Someone wasn't trying to scare him away. They were gathering intel, tracking him, tracking Shadow, tracking the ridge. He ripped the device from its mount and crushed it under his boot, feeling the plastic crack. Shadow looked up at him, chest rising sharp, waiting for direction. Cal whispered, "You were right from the start." The canyon, once wide and empty, now felt crowded with eyes. He glanced toward the stone ridge wall. The rectangular stone he'd removed still lay near the hearth like an accusation. The metal case and Jonah's notebook were hidden under a floorboard now, concealed but not safe. Someone knew he found them. Someone had come looking. Cal scanned the tree line again. The silence had changed. Not the quiet of wilderness, the quiet of surveillance. The quiet Jonah described in his journal right before he vanished. Shadow nudged Cal's hand. Not anxious. Focused. Anchoring him back into the present. Cal tightened his grip on the dog's fur. "We move smart, partner. We move careful, but we don't back down." Shadow's ears flicked forward. A sound echoed in the canyon. Distant, metallic, like a door closing or a tailgate slamming shut. Too far to track, too close to ignore. Cal felt a familiar shift inside his chest. Not fear. Readiness. The old soldier waking up, piecing together terrain, angles, threats. Someone out there doesn't want the truth coming back into daylight. He looked toward the ridge again. But they didn't expect a man with a dog who doesn't miss a sound. And they didn't expect the ridge to start talking again. The night air carried a strange stillness, the kind that comes before a storm or a breaking point. Cal felt it deep in his ribs as he fed the fire. Shadow curled nearby, but not asleep. The shepherd's ears twitched, tracking sounds Cal couldn't hear. Then Shadow lifted his head, sharply. A single growl vibrated through the cabin floor. Cal rose. Every instinct he'd spent years perfecting, sharpened in an instant. He stepped toward the back door just as the lamp beside it flickered. Shadow lunged first. The door exploded inward. A masked man barreled through, slipping on the rug, a crowbar catching the edge of the table. A second figure pushed in behind him, moving fast and low. Shadow collided with the first intruder mid-breath. The impact was violent enough to knock the man sideways into the counter. The dog's jaws locked onto his forearm with a crack that echoed like snapped timber. The intruder screamed, high and ragged, dropping the crowbar as Shadow dragged him down. Cal ducked behind the stove and fired upward with the shotgun he'd kept loaded since the sheriff's visit. Pellets ripped through the ceiling beam beside the second man, forcing him back. Then something clattered on the floor. Glass. A bottle with a burning rag shoved through the mouth rolled towards the hearth. Molotov. The flame touched the spilled kerosene on the floorboard, and the cabin erupted in hungry orange light. Cal grabbed the back of Shadow's harness. The dog resisted, still driving the first intruder into the floor. Blood streaked the boards under his paws. The man tried to scramble free, screaming for help, but Shadow's teeth were buried deep, unrelenting. Shadow. Out. Now! His voice cut through the chaos. Shadow released with a guttural snarl, limping as he turned. Cal caught the wound immediately. A knife slash across the dog's shoulder, bleeding through the fur. The second intruder regrouped near the doorway, raising a pistol. Cal swung the shotgun like a club, catching the man across the jaw. Bone crunched. The masked figure collapsed backward into the flames, licking along the floorboards. Outside. Move. Cal pulled Shadow through the smoke as heat roared behind them. The fire moved fast, climbing up the log walls like it had been waiting its whole life to burn. The roof groaned overhead, embers raining from the rafters. They burst into the freezing canyon air. Cal dragged the dog to the cover of a rock outcrop. The fire reflected in Shadow's dark eyes. Then he saw it, a silhouette atop Stone Ridge. A tall man, coat flapping in the wind, boots planted on the red rock like a judge presiding over a sentence. Silas Ward, Director of Security for Red Canyon Water, accommodated the ghost behind 12 years of silence. The man Jonah wrote about in the final pages of the journal. The architect of missing permits, vanished reports, and a valley full of poisoned wells. His voice carried across the canyon, calm as a sermon. You should have stayed in the war, Becca. Would have lived longer. Flames from the cabin lit the ridge behind him. His men spread out along the rocks, rifles glinting. Silas lifted one hand, pointing toward the burning cabin. That place held a story no one needed. Now it's gone. No cabin, no narrative, no evidence. The fire cleans the past. Shadow growled, the sound low and broken, but fierce despite the wound. Silas smirked. Even your dog knows what comes next. We clean up the ridge, we clean up you. Cal stepped forward, steady despite the fire clawing behind him. The blaze lit his face just enough for Silas to see the expression that didn't belong to a man cornered. Not fear, not anger, confidence. You're late, Ward. Silas blinked, thrown off balance. Late for what? Cal let the words land one by one. For the story going public. Silas stiffened. What story? Jonah Reddick's. Everything under the ridge, every map, every sample, every name. Silas shook his head. Liar. Cal stepped forward again. I sent it all, hours ago, to a journalist in Salt Lake. He's printing by dawn. The wind shifted. The flames behind Cal roared high enough to illuminate Silas's face, and for the first time, the architect of fear, of threats, of poisoned land, of vanished truth, lost control of his expression. His breath faltered, his jaw tightened. Panic cracked through the facade. You didn't. I did, Cal said, and he'll have federal eyes on this canyon before you get off that ridge. Silas snapped his head toward his men, barked orders that tripped over themselves. Stop him! Find the files! Get down there now! But the cabin was already collapsing, flames swallowing the roof in a violent swell of sparks. Whatever he hoped to retrieve was gone, twisted into ash. Cal rested a hand on Shadow's neck, grounding the shaking dog. Silas roared into the firelit night, voice breaking. This isn't over, Becca. Do you hear me? It's not over. Cal's reply was quiet, but in the canyon silence, it carried like a final verdict. It's already over. You just didn't see it coming. Shadow leaned against him, bleeding but unbowed, his breath steadying in cold bursts. Beside them, the cabin burned down to its bones, but not to its truth. The truth was already traveling the highway toward Salt Lake City, and Red Canyon had just lost its silence. For a moment, the canyon held its breath. The only sound was the crackling skeleton of the burning cabin and the ragged rise and fall of Shadow's breathing against Cal's leg. Silas Ward still stood atop Stone Ridge, barking frantic orders to his men, but the fire had swallowed his power. His silhouettes looked smaller now, edged by flame and fear. Then a new sound ripped across the night. A distant thump, low, rhythmic, growing, rotor blades. Cal lifted his head. Shadow did too, ears pushing forward, despite the blood matting his fur. The thudding grew louder until a black helicopter burst over the ridge, searchlights slicing through smoke. The sudden blast of wind kicked ash into swirling halos. Silas stumbled backwards, caught off guard. Down! Cal yelled, pulling Shadow beside a boulder. The helicopter banked hard, hovering low enough for the dust to sting Cal's face. A voice boomed through a loudspeaker. Federal agents, drop your weapons and step away from the edge. Silas shouted something incoherent, waving his arms like a man arguing with the sky. His men hesitated, rifles wavering. Then floodlights lit up the canyon as a convoy of vehicles crawled up the trail below. Engines growled. Doors slammed. Dozens of figures in tactical gear fanned out, forming a perimeter with practiced precision. Red and blue strobes washed across the canyon floor. Shadow's body pressed tighter to Cal's side as the ground team advanced. A second helicopter swooped in, lowering a rope line. FBI agents rappelled down in a flawless, synchronized descent, hitting the ridge with boots already moving. One agent leveled a rifle at Silas. Hands where we can see them. Silas backed toward the drop-off, face contorted in disbelief. This isn't possible, he hissed. He didn't make it in time. He couldn't have. Cal stepped out from cover as the flames behind him threw long shadows across the clearing. You underestimated two things, Silas. Silas stared at him, shaking with fury, Kel raised a hand, placing it gently on Shadow's neck. Him, and the truth. Silas finally broke. He reached for the pistol at his hip. Before Cal could shout, 4 FBI rifles clicked into firing position. Don't do it! Silas froze, torn between pride and survival. Then he dropped the weapon, the metallic clatter swallowed by the wind. Agents swarmed in. 2 tackled Silas, forcing him to the ground, zip ties cinched around his wrists. Others disarmed and detained his remaining men. The canyon echoed with the sound of boots, shouts, and the metallic rhythm of restraints locking shut. One agent approached Cal, visor lifted, breath fogging in the cold. You Calvin Becker? Cal nodded. The agent motioned at the burning ruins behind him. We got a call from a reporter in Salt Lake City. He said if we didn't move fast, we'd be pulling bodies from a fire. He also said you had evidence tied to a federal investigation. Cal exhaled slowly. The weight he had been carrying for days settled into something steadier, no longer a burden, but a purpose completed. It's secure, he said, and it's backed up in more than one place. The agent gave a low whistle. Well, you just helped blow open a 12-year silence. Shadow shifted beside Cal, limping slightly but still alert. The agent crouched down, studying the dog with curiosity and something like respect. This dog saved your life tonight. Cal rested his hand on Shadow's shoulder. The shepherd looked up at him, eyes sharp even through the pain. No, Cal said. He saved the truth. The agent nodded, slow and deliberate, as if committing the words to memory. Behind them, Silas was dragged toward a transport vehicle, still shouting, still refusing to accept that the canyon he once controlled had turned against him. But no one listened anymore. The ridge glowed with firelight. The helicopter's search beams swept the canyon one last time. The agents collected weapons, secured the intruders, and marked the scene. Cal felt Shadow lean his weight against him, the dog exhausted but unbroken. We're still here, boy, Cal whispered. We're still standing. Shadow nudged Cal's hand once, gently, as if answering. As agents began photographing the site and logging evidence from the hillside, the lead FBI officer walked back toward Cal. We'll need your full statement. Every detail, but not tonight. Right now, get that dog seen by our medic. Cal nodded. Shadow had earned more than medical attention. He had earned the canyon's silence lifting. He had earned the truth stepping back into daylight. And for the first time since stepping into Red Canyon, Cal felt the shift. The ridge wasn't watching him with threat. It was watching with relief. Justice had finally begun to move. The fire took hours to die, but the story it released spread faster than smoke ever could. By dawn the next day, Red Canyon was on every major network. Footage of FBI convoys snaking through the desert. Aerial shots of the burned cabin. Headlines blazing across screens like warning flares. 12-year cover-up exposed in Utah's Red Canyon. Missing investigative journalist linked to toxic waste scandal. Former military K-9 helps uncover evidence buried beneath Stone Ridge. Cal watched none of it. He turned off the radio the moment he heard his own name. Reporters camped at the edge of town. A documentary crew from Los Angeles drove in before sunrise. News vans parked near the canyon entrance, as if waiting for a curtain to lift. But Cal kept to the ridge, where the land was still quiet, still honest. Shadow healed faster than anyone expected. The medic had warned of tendon damage, maybe long-term stiffness, but within a week the shepherd was back on his feet, limping only when the morning was cold. The VA called before the stitches were pulled. They had heard about Shadow's instincts, about his absolute focus during threat, about how he stayed locked on Cal even when the world caught fire behind them. A therapist spoke softly through the line. We're launching a pilot program, pairing retired working dogs with veterans struggling to reset their internal alarms. Would Shadow be available for assessment? Cal looked down. Shadow had been lying in the doorway, head resting on his paws. At the sound of his name, he lifted his eyes. They were calm in a way Cal didn't entirely understand. Not submissive, not fatigued, just ready. You want to try it? Cal asked him, voice low. Shadow rose, walked toward him, and gently pressed his forehead to Cal's chest. That was answer enough. The program coordinator arrived a week later, hiking the last half-mile after her SUV refused to climb the washed-out trail. She sat cross-legged in the dirt beside Shadow and let him approach her on his own terms. Cal watched from the porch, unsure how to feel about someone else reading the dog who'd read him better than anyone ever had. After a long while, the woman wiped at her eyes and whispered, "I haven't felt this peaceful in months." And that was that. Shadow joined the rotation. Not as a service dog, not as a therapy tool, as a partner to veterans the world hadn't stopped wounding. Cal rebuilt the cabin slowly, not because he had to, but because the land deserved patience. He cleared debris until the ridge stone reappeared beneath the soot, the same stone that once hid Jonah's truth. When the new foundation cured, Cal pressed his palm against the ridge face like greeting an old sentinel. "You held more than secrets," he murmured. "You held the line for us." The new cabin rose with wide eaves, better ventilation, a steel chimney instead of stone. But one thing he rebuilt exactly as it had been. The ridge-facing wall, where the false slab once sat. He left a narrow cutout above it, a kind of window frame, so light could fall across that spot every morning. A reminder of what silence can bury, and what instinct can unearth. Shadow chose his resting place without hesitation, a corner of the porch with a full view of the trail. He slept there most afternoons, chin on his paws, the desert wind riffling his coat. Sometimes his ears twitched at distant sounds, an ATV, a hawk's cry, the echo of boots on sandstone. Cal stood beside him one morning, steaming mug in hand. The rebuilt cabin smelled of cedar and earth, nothing like the smoke that once clung to his skin. The ridge cast a long shadow across the sand, cool and steady. "You did it," Cal whispered. "You carried the truth out of the fire." Shadow didn't look up. He didn't need to. His tail thumped once against the porch, slow and sure. Letters began arriving. Veterans thanking Shadow for showing them bravery wasn't always loud. Families writing about wells they'd tested, towns demanding accountability. Survivors from Red Canyon water command schemes shared stories of illnesses, losses, fears they'd buried but never understood. Cal read the letters only when the nights were quiet. He answered few, but Shadow listened to all of them, head tilted, eyes soft. One evening, as the sun dipped behind Stone Ridge, Cal found himself staring at the horizon longer than usual. The sky bled crimson, the same color as the canyon cliffs that had once frightened newcomers and shielded secrets. "We're still here," he said quietly. Shadow brushed against his leg, steady as breath. Reporters still tried to find him. A magazine wanted him on the cover. A streaming service pitched a documentary. Someone mailed him a check with more zeros than he'd ever seen. Cal returned all of it. He didn't want fame. He wanted quiet. The kind earned after holding a line most men never see. And Red Canyon, wounded and scarred, gave him that quiet. Slowly, even gently. Sometimes, when the wind curled through the ridge, Cal could almost feel Jonah's presence in the stone. Not haunting, but watching. Grateful. The truth had a home again. And so did they. A year had passed since the night the canyon burned and the truth clawed its way out of stone. Red Canyon looked different now. Not healed, not entirely, but breathing again. The air felt lighter. The ridge no longer carried that taut, waiting silence. Even the wind seemed to move with less burden, weaving through the sandstone like it had found its old rhythm. The therapy center sat just below the rebuilt cabin, a modest structure of timber and glass where the desert sun warmed the floors each morning. Veterans came in small groups, sometimes alone, sometimes with families who still didn't know how to speak about the shadows following them home. Shadow had become the quiet center of that place, a steady gravity everyone instinctively leaned toward. On this particular morning, a school bus parked near the trailhead. A dozen middle school kids stepped out, jackets zipped to their chins, sneakers crunching on gravel. Teachers herded them into a loose line, but their eyes kept wandering, to the ridge, to the cabin perched above it, and finally to the large German shepherd resting on the porch. Shadow lifted his head as they approached. His muzzle had more silver now, a soft dusting like winter frost. His posture was slower, more deliberate, but his eyes remained bright, alert, the same eyes that had stared straight through stone the night everything began. Cal came down the steps, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. The kids quieted without being told. Something about the place demanded it. "Thanks for having us," one of the teachers said. "They've been reading about the investigation in class. They wanted to see the dog who, well, helped change half the state." Cal gave a small nod. He didn't correct her. Shadow wasn't interested in titles anyway. The group gathered near a wooden bench overlooking the ridge. The wind carried the faint scent of juniper and warm dust. One boy, small for his age and gripping a spiral notebook to his chest, raised his hand timidly. "Is it true?" he asked, voice cracking a little. "That your dog found a hidden room under the stone wall? Like in the news?" Cal looked down at Shadow. The dog blinked once, slow, as if remembering the moment his paw struck that false stone. A moment when instinct spoke louder than any words. "Yes," Cal said. "It's true." The boy hesitated, then asked the question he'd clearly rehearsed. "But why him? Why did your dog find it when nobody else could?" Cal knelt beside Shadow, sliding a hand gently along the ridge of his back. Shadow leaned into the touch, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Because long before we trust ourselves." Cal said, "Dogs already know." The wind softened. The boy stared at Shadow with something like awe. A few of the girls whispered quietly, scribbling notes. One teacher wiped at her eyes, pretending it was just the sunlight. Cal stood again. Slow, his joints stiff from old wounds. He never spoke much during these visits. Words felt too small for what the canyon had taught him. But today, something in the air tugged him forward. He motioned for the group to follow him toward the ridge-facing wall of the cabin. Sunlight struck the cutout window he'd carved above the rebuilt hearth, casting a beam on the exact spot where Jonah Reddick's hidden chamber had been sealed shut for 12 silent years. "This is where it happened," Cal said, "where the truth waited." One student stepped closer. Did it feel scary, being here that night? Cal exhaled. His gaze drifted down the slope where he and Shadow had once fled between burning trees. "It felt like the world was holding its breath," he said. "And the only thing louder than the fire was the sound of my dog telling me not to give up." Shadow shifted beside him, lowering his weight slowly onto his elbows. Age had softened him, but hadn't dimmed his presence. He watched the students with the calm of a soldier long off the battlefield, yet still aware of every movement. A girl with dark braids pointed to the ridge's base. "My mum says this place used to feel haunted," she said, "like something was wrong here." Cal studied the stone. For years it had been a tomb, of evidence, of fear, of a man's last hope to speak before he vanished. Now it simply looked like part of the land again, scarred but honest. It wasn't haunted, Cal said. It was waiting for someone brave enough to listen. A murmur moved through the students. Shadow's ears twitched at the sound. Then a teacher asked softly, almost cautiously, "And what about now? What is this place to you?" Cal didn't answer immediately. He ran a hand through Shadow's fur, feeling the warmth beneath it, feeling the steady rhythm of breath in a dog who had faced fire and bullets and still chosen to stand between him and danger. "Now," he said finally, "it's a place where truth lives instead of hides." The group fell quiet again. Even the wind paused long enough for the words to settle. A rustle came from behind them. Another class arrived early, climbing the trail with a counselor from the therapy program. 2 veterans walked among them. One limped on a prosthetic leg. The other kept his jaw tight, eyes scanning the terrain out of habit he couldn't shake. Shadow rose at the sight, his body lifting with effort but purpose. He walked toward them, tail low, steps measured. When the troubled veteran paused at the top of the trail, Shadow simply sat in front of him, steady and unyielding. The man exhaled, shoulders falling for the first time since he'd stepped off the bus. The teacher whispered to Cal, "Does he always know who needs him?" Cal nodded. "He's always known." The students lingered a while longer, taking photos of the ridge and writing down lines from Cal's answers. But their eyes kept returning to Shadow, the aging shepherd who had dragged the truth out from beneath stone and silence. As the group finally began heading back toward the bus, one boy turned and waved. "Bye, Shadow," he shouted. "Thank you for finding the room." Shadow lifted his head, tail flicking once in, acknowledgement. Cal watched them go, their laughter floating across the canyon like something the land hadn't heard in years. When they were out of sight, Cal lowered himself onto the porch beside Shadow. "You've built something here, old man," he murmured. "Something that'll outlive both of us." Shadow placed his head on Cal's boot, eyes half closed but alert enough to catch the movement of a hawk overhead. The ridge stood quiet behind them. The truth, once buried and suffocating, now breathed freely in the open air. And Cal understood something he hadn't known a year ago. Legacy wasn't carved into stone. It was carried in 4 paws, in steady breath, in the instinct that refuses to let the world forget what matters. Shadow sighed, long and content. He was still watching, still guarding, and the ridge, at last, was at peace. The sun sagged low over Red Canyon, spilling copper light across the ridge until the stones glowed like embers remembering fire. Evening always came softly here now. The land no longer braced for danger. It simply breathed. Cal stood on the porch of the rebuilt cabin, one hand resting on the railing worn smooth by desert wind. A small group of young volunteers gathered below, most of them from the therapy program, some from the local university. They had spent the day cleaning trail markers, refreshing water stations, and helping catalog materials for the PTSD support center. Shadow lay beside Cal, his silhouette solid against the fading light. Age touched his joints, slowed his rise, softened his steps, but his presence remained unbreakable. He still watched the canyon the way a soldier watches a perimeter, not out of fear, out of duty. The volunteers settled around the fire pit, waiting for Cal to speak. A few of them had only read about him. Fewer had understood the weight of what happened on this ridge. None had lived it like the man standing in front of them, or like the dog at his heel. Cal cleared his throat. He didn't talk much. Never had. But some truths belonged to more than silence. "You look at this place now," he said, "and you see open sky, clean air, a land that feels proud again. But that wasn't always the story." A quiet fell over the group. Even the wind paused to listen. Years ago, this canyon held something it shouldn't have. Cal continued. Something buried deep. Not just evidence, not just lies. Fear. A fear so heavy it made people turn away instead of face it. He rested a hand gently on Shadow's back. "And this dog," he said, "he didn't bark for food. He barked for the truth buried under this canyon for years." Shadow didn't move, but his ears twitched, as if acknowledging the words. One of the younger volunteers, a girl no older than 16, raised her hand hesitantly. "Mr. Becker, how did he know? Before anyone else even suspected?" Cal smiled faintly, lines deepening around his eyes. "Because dogs carry a sense we lost somewhere along the way. They hear what we ignore. They see what we deny. And they never confuse silence with peace." Shadow slowly pushed himself to a sitting position, leaning lightly against Cal's leg. In the dimming light, the silver in his fur sparked like quartz in the ridge stone. Cal looked down at him, voice softening. This canyon was choking on secrets, and he refused to let it die that way. The volunteers glanced at one another. A few wiped at their eyes, though none admitted it. The ridge behind them glowed deep red, the same shade it had the night Silas Ward fell and the truth rose. Cal motioned toward the canyon. Jonah Reddick left a trail in the dark. I just followed it. But Shadow, he's the one who tore the silence open. The girl whispered, "So this place is his legacy." Cal nodded. His and anyone willing to face what's buried instead of pretending it isn't there. The group fell quiet again. It wasn't the heavy hush of fear. It was reverence, the kind that settles on a moment too honest to interrupt. As the last of the sun dipped below the ridge, the cameraman from the therapy center stepped back to capture a final shot for their awareness fundraiser. The frame widened, pulling Cal and Shadow into silhouette. The cabin and fire pit blurred behind them. Stone Ridge towered above, red and timeless. The canyon looked like a heartbeat. Cal's voice, steady and worn, carried across the sand. If you ever wonder what loyalty looks like, look at a dog who walks into fire because he thinks you might need him. A volunteer whispered, "That's beautiful." Cal shook his head. "It's true." Shadow stood slowly, lifting his weight with deliberate strength. He leaned gently against Cal's leg, gaze sweeping the ridge once more, as if assuring himself the land was finally safe. The camera kept rolling. The wind slipped through the sandstone hollows. And then, as the frame pulled back toward the darkening sky, a final question drifted into the quiet, spoken not by Cal, not by a volunteer, but by the narrator preparing the clip for the online release. "What's your story with a loyal pet?" A moment of stillness followed. The kind that invites memory. The kind that belongs to anyone who's ever been saved by 4 paws, a steady gaze, or a bark that meant more than language. Cal placed a hand on Shadow's shoulder. "We're still watching," he murmured, still guarding. The screen faded to black, leaving only the echo of the canyon wind. "Let us hear your story. Support the mission. Honor the ones who never stopped protecting. Subscribe to German Shepherd, where loyalty lives."